The sun that rose over the plains of Jericho did not just illuminate a city, it revealed a monument to impossible victory. The air still tasted of dust, not the dry, ancient dust of the desert, but the fresh, pulverized mortar of walls that had stood for centuries, only to collapse at a shout and the blast of ram's horns. For the Israelites, it was the zenith of divine favor. They had crossed the Jordan on dry land, they had celebrated Passover in the shadow of their enemies, and they had seen the premier fortress of Canaan crumble before them without a single ladder scaled. As I read this account, I can almost feel the collective intake of breath, the surge of terrifying confidence that must have pulsed through the camp. They were invincible. The land promised to their ancestors was finally, visibly, within their grasp. They believed that no force on earth could stand against them because the Almighty was their vanguard. Yet this moment of absolute triumph held the seeds of absolute terror. In the immediate aftermath, amidst the ruins of Jericho, an instruction had been given, an absolute, non-negotiable command. Everything in the city was harem, a Hebrew term meaning devoted entirely to destruction, set apart for the Lord. It was not war booty, it was consecrated for annihilation. Gold, silver, bronze, and iron were to enter the treasury of the Lord's house, but nothing else was to be taken. To touch the harem was to invite that same destruction upon oneself. It was a spiritual quarantine. The wealth of Jericho was infected with a curse, and the safety of the entire nation depended on absolute obedience to this boundary. And so, the narrative pivots, brutal in its suddenness. Fresh from this miraculous siege, Joshua, the seasoned commander, sets his sights on the next target, a smaller, insignificant settlement called Ai. It was a logical step, a minor obstacle on the road to central Canaan. Spies are sent, and they return with a report steeped in complacency. Not all the people need to go up. Let about 2,000 or 3,000 men go up and attack Ai. Do not make the whole people toil up there, for they are few. They had seen Jericho fall. Ai would be a skirmish. There was no need for the ark, no need for complex strategies, only a small contingent to finish a simple job. Joshua agrees. The machinery of war is set in motion, fueled by the memory of a victory they believed was now their default setting. 3,000 men, confident and proud, march toward Ai, expecting a quick surrender. Instead, they met a wall of unexpected fury. The men of Ai did not cower. They struck. We aren't given the tactical details of how the Israelite line broke, but the rout was total. They fled. The same army that had terrified all of Canaan was now running for their lives down the steep slopes, pursued by an energized enemy, and in that chaotic retreat, 36 men were cut down. Their blood stained the soil of a land that was supposed to be theirs. This is the point where the ground shifts beneath the reader's feet. 36 deaths might seem statistically small compared to ancient battles, but in the context of Joshua, it is seismic. This was the first defeat. The invincibility was shattered. But it wasn't the strength of Ai that caused the rout. The true terror of this moment lies not in the 36 lost lives, but in the why. When I reflect on those 36, I don't just see soldiers. I see fathers, sons, and brothers who died in utter confusion. They died believing God was with them, only to discover, in their final moments, that the shield of divine protection had been inexplicably withdrawn. The camp of Israel, upon hearing the news, melted. Their hearts became like water. The terror that once belonged to their enemies was now paralyzing them. The silent question echoed. What had gone wrong? To understand the terror of those 36 deaths, we must first grapple with the concept of harem and the unique status of Jericho. This was not a standard battle of conquest. The siege of Jericho was a liturgical event as much as a military one. For 7 days, the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant around the city walls, followed by the armed men, in total silence. On the 7th day, after 7 circuits, the silence was broken only by the shout of the people and the blast of the shofar. This was God's war. The victory was entirely His. Because of this, the first fruits of the conquest, the entire city of Jericho, belonged to Him alone. The herem, the decree of total destruction, served 2 purposes. First, it was a radical statement of devotion. All potential gain was sacrificed to God. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it was a practical measure of spiritual and cultural quarantine. Canaanite society, exemplified by Jericho, was perceived as terminally corrupt, saturated with idolatry and practices that were an abomination to the Israelite faith. The herem was a firewall. To take anything from the city, whether a garment, a vessel, or even livestock, was to dismantle that firewall and invite the spiritual contagion into the heart of the Israelite camp. This quarantine was not a secret. Joshua had explicitly warned the people, "But you keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest when you have devoted them you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction and bring trouble upon it." The lines were clearly drawn. Life and death were separated by a single rule: do not touch. This command was the very source of their safety. Their protection did not come from their own swords, but from their separateness, their holiness as a people set apart for God. By violating the herem, an individual was not just stealing. They were committing an act of spiritual treason, breaching the perimeter of divine protection. What makes this account so chilling is the reality that in the euphoric chaos of Jericho's fall, as the walls crumbled and the city was taken, this life and death warning was, for one man, eclipsed by a seductive golden opportunity. Thousands obeyed, but one looked, and the boundary that protected 36 families was quietly crossed. The spiritual immunity of an entire nation was compromised in the darkness of a single temptation. As I read, I always pause at the transition from national victory to personal vulnerability. While Israel was celebrating, one man, a soldier named Achan from the prominent tribe of Judah, was walking through the ruins. In the midst of the desolation and the divine mandate for total destruction, his eyes landed on 3 items. The text records them specifically: a beautiful cloak from Shinar, Babylon, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels. This is the central moment, the pivot upon which the tragedy of the 36 hinges. We must try to understand the psychology of this temptation. Achan was not a cartoon villain. He was a soldier, a man who had presumably marched around the walls, who had shouted, and who had witnessed the power of God. But in the presence of that Babylonian garment, his resolve crumbled. The cloak represented status, luxury, the sophisticated world beyond the nomadic life they had known. The gold and silver were security, wealth that could change his family's future forever. Achan looked at the forbidden items. Then, the text says, he coveted them. The internal line was crossed before the physical act. He justified his desire. Perhaps he thought, this city is destroyed anyway. Who will miss this? 1 cloak? A few coins? God has given us the whole city. Surely He won't begrudge me this small gain. I've fought hard. I deserve this. We all know the voice of that internal justification, the quiet negotiation we make when we want something we shouldn't have. Achan convinced himself that his action was isolated, a victimless crime. Then, he took them. In that one act of theft, Achan believed he was securing his family's future. He sneaked the items back to his tent. But he couldn't simply display them. They were harem, infected. So he had to bury them. The image is haunting. Ashan, a victorious Israelite soldier, alone in his tent, digging a pit in the earth, burying his status and wealth beneath the very ground he slept on. He covered the hole, placed his mat over it, and walked out. He resumed his place in the camp, appearing as holy and obedient as everyone else. But he carried a lethal secret. Beneath his feet lay the material breach that had invited the curse. He thought he had hidden a treasure. In reality, he had buried a death sentence for 36 of his countrymen. The silence of that hidden pit was the silence of 36 graves waiting to be filled. Achan's secret lay buried, its corruption spreading invisibly through the camp, while the physical world proceeded as if nothing had changed. Joshua, unaware that the terms of engagement had shifted, finalized the plans for Ai. The small force of 3,000, energized by the complacency of the spies' report, began their ascent toward the city. For these soldiers, this was a matter of routine, the inevitable next step in an already decided conquest. They were marching toward victory. But as they approached Ai, the air must have felt different. The expected fear in the eyes of their enemies was absent. Instead, the men of Ai poured out of their gates with a ferocity that stunned the Israelite advance guard. This was not a skirmish. It was an onslaught. The Israelites, accustomed to seeing walls fall at a shout, were completely unprepared for resistance. Their confidence, built on a now absent promise, instantly evaporated. When the men of Ai struck, the Israelite line did not just bend, it shattered. The 3,000 men who had marched up with songs of triumph were now fleeing in terror, stumbling down the steep slope they had so easily ascended. It was a chaotic, panic-stricken rout. The men of Ai pursued them mercilessly, cutting down any who lagged. We don't have the details of how those 36 died, whether from spears in the back, falling down the ravine, or being surrounded. But their deaths were the defining reality of the battle. 36 Israelite soldiers, whose lives had been part of a grand redemptive story, were abandoned on the battlefield. When I imagine the return of that defeated army, I don't just see tired men, I see broken men. They returned not with news of victory, but with the stench of defeat and the horrifying news of their fallen brothers. The psychological impact on the nation was catastrophic. The text describes the people's response with a vivid metaphor. And the hearts of the people melted and became as water. Their invincibility, the very cornerstone of their identity since crossing the Jordan, was a lie. God was no longer their vanguard. He had become, in effect, their enemy, withdrawing his protection and allowing their defeat. The terror of the 36 deaths was the terror of realizing they were alone. The disaster at Ai drove Joshua to the only place he could go. In a display of profound national mourning and desperation, he tore his clothes and fell face down before the Ark of the Covenant, staying there until evening with the elders of Israel. They put dust on their heads, a symbol of total humiliation. Joshua's prayer is raw and revealing. He doesn't ask what went wrong. He asks why God did this. He blames God for bringing them across the Jordan only to destroy them, and he expresses his deepest fear. When the Canaanites hear of this defeat, they will surround and destroy them. And what will you do for your great name? The response from the Lord is as terrifying in its clarity as it is abrupt. There are no comforting words. Get up. Why have you fallen on your face? Israel has sinned. They have transgressed my covenant that I commanded them. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen and lied and put them among their own belongings. The source of the defeat is named. The harem was breached. The spiritual quarantine was violated. The 36 did not die because Ai was strong. They died because Israel was infected. The consequence is equally stark. I will be with you no more unless you destroy the devoted things from among you." The next morning, the most terrifying lottery in history began. This wasn't a search for a criminal. It was a divine identification of a spiritual infection. Joshua commanded the entire nation, tribe by tribe, family by family, household by household, and man by man, to present themselves. The process was likely done by casting lots, perhaps using the Urim and Thummim. Imagine the atmosphere in the camp that morning. The usual routines were suspended. Millions of people stood in silent lines, the tension suffocating. Every man in that line, even the innocent, must have felt a shadow of dread. For Achan, standing among his tribe of Judah, this was the beginning of an inescapable reckoning. As the lottery began, the tension must have been almost unbearable. The lot fell to the tribe of Judah. Achan's heart must have skipped a beat. The lot fell to the family of the Zerahites. The net was tightening. The lot fell to the household of Zabdi. The infection was localized. Each name that was cleared brought a wave of relief, except for Achan. He was trapped, watching the divine finger point with relentless, terrifying accuracy toward his tent. He had buried the secret, but he could not bury the consequences. He had thought his sin was private, but now it was a public spectacle, and the lives of 36 men were the evidence. The silence of that lottery was the loudest accusation he had ever heard. The lottery finally stopped, pointing directly and undeniably at Achan. He stood before the nation, exposed. The time for denial was over. Joshua, dealing not with a common criminal, but with the source of a national curse, spoke to him with surprising tenderness. "My son, give glory to the Lord God of Israel and give praise to him. And tell me now what you have done. Do not hide it from me." This was not an interrogation for confession, but an opportunity for Achan to acknowledge his sin and, in doing so, restore the integrity of the covenant. Achan confessed. His words were precise, matching the items Joshua's messengers would find. "Truly I have sinned against the Lord God of Israel, and this is what I did. When I saw among the spoil a beautiful cloak from Shinar, and 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, then I coveted them and took them. And see, they are hidden in the earth inside my tent, with the silver underneath." He didn't just admit the act, he admitted the appetite that led to it. Messengers were sent, and they found the hidden pit exactly as Achan described. The stolen items, the cloak, the silver, and the gold, were dug up and, in a powerful act of ritual purification, were laid out before the Lord for all to see. The glittering treasures that had cost 36 lives were now revealed as the infected cargo of a curse. The sentence was swift and absolute. Achan and his entire household, along with all his possessions and the stolen items, were taken to a location that would be forever marked by this event. They were taken to the Valley of Achor, which means the Valley of Trouble. There, the entire nation participated in his execution. The text states he was stoned and then burned, a ritual purification designed to completely erase the infection from the camp. This punishment is modernly shocking, but to the Israelites, it was the only way to survive. The quarantine had to be reestablished. The connection between sin and death was not metaphorical. It was physical, evidenced by the 36 bodies left on the battlefield of Ai. When I read the final lines of this account, I am left with a terrifying sense of scale. Achan's choice was private, his theft was hidden, and he likely believed it affected no one but himself. Yet, that private secret acted like a fracture in the shield of an entire nation. The 36 men who died were not just casualties of war, they were the first victims of a hidden compromise. The lesson from the Valley of Achor is that in the community of faith, there is no such thing as private sin. The secret we bury in our own tent can create a vulnerability through which tragedy, confusion, and death can invade the lives of those around us. The story of Achan is the story of how the most terrifying secrets are the ones that kill.